fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are yet once again listening to Architecture Talk. Currently we are going through a mini series, Architecture in the Time of Coronavirus, where we are trying to advance the frontier of architectural thinking in a way that is concerned directly and indirectly with the fantastic and deleterious constraints on social and daily life that is being put on us by the coronavirus situation. We will continue to have these recordings for the next few weeks. And today I'm excited to note that with this episode, we are also going to begin to publish a series of new visual graphics, cartoons, if you like, that somehow are responsive to our conversation, being done by Tori Haynes, who designed the logo of Architecture Talk as well. Look out for these on our website, architecturetalk.org. And if you have any thoughts and comments, please do let us know. Today I'm talking to Mitchell, Joachim, and Nick of Terreform, who have this fantastic experimental practice that is very interested in thinking about another kind of architecture, a future architecture, which is bio-friendly, which works with biology in a manner that we are not used to. A very germane discussion in the current context. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Nick and Mitch, welcome to Architecture Talk. Thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me.
We're super glad to be here with you.
I've been looking at your website, Terreform, and it's a fascinating website. It appears and presents itself as a as a radical alternative practice. And I'm very excited to talk to you because the kinds of contentions that you're putting forth in your practice seem to be particularly germane to these very strange and interesting times that we find ourselves in with the coronavirus. Not so much in terms of the isolation that we are finding ourselves in, but in terms of what it means, in one sense, to live with a pandemic, to how to live with a germ, how to live with another kind of living matter in a way that, in this case, governs our life form. So in the introduction to your book, Design with Life, actually, I think, Mitch, this is your book. You talk about the importance at Terreform of the regenerative use of natural materials and the emergent field of socio-ecological design. You say that your approach to design uses actual living matter. Actual living matter.
Yeah.
Not abstracted imitations of nature to create new functional elements in spaces. And I've seen, some of your projects online and a short TED talk that's online, and very much so it's about, you talk about growing materials and as living systems, as living entities, using anal sphincters as windows provocatively, and so on and so forth. Talk to us about why is it that you are so focused on actual living matter as the fabric of contemporary or future-oriented architectural thinking versus, let's say, things that are more imitative or performative.
Yeah, I love that introduction and the fact that you somehow were able to weave in anal sphincter into the conversation early on. You just got that out of the way. So that's good. That's good. We've reached that point. We can handle it from here. For a very long time, there has been these ideas about environment and architecture, and it's becoming something of a bromide. I think that almost every firm needs to incorporate ideas about sustainability, ideas about green, certainly concepts that work within the Earth's metabolism. That's something that many firms have been doing, especially postmodernism. That has been just a polemic that's nonstop. We have branched off probably two more levels into this idea of green. And maybe it started with notions of organic architecture, which, if we go to Frank Lloyd Wright, have a very different meaning than, I would say, perhaps Calatrava, etc., and some of the biomimicists. And now there is, others like John Todd and I guess Rachel Armstrong and Jenny Sabin, like our David Benjamin, people that really are working directly with living organisms, not mimicking
Right.
organisms or decorative elements.
Right. I just published a podcast interview with Rachel Armstrong, by the way, but go on.
There you go. She is absolutely brilliant, and we love her work. And she's been a close colleague also for some time. So her and Mark Jarzenbach are some really good people to keep company with. But the idea that you mimic nature is not new. Mimesis has been around since Aristotle, certainly ancient China. This is a global kind of concept. Where else did early humankind look to find ideas but in the natural world? So that's not really special, certainly not to architects. But Frank Lloyd Wright liked to use the term organic. And
Right, you did.
he did. And he meant that in a number of ways. There's some arguments about programmatic, inside and outside, ideas about decoration and material, but it was still very much concrete, glass, and steel in a context that is wilderness or wildness.
Right.
We've decided that we've got to go one notch further and actually have things that are alive and are actual organisms in a kind of an epigenetic context. So it's not only the
Why is that the critical distinction here?
Yeah. So we have in every project have sort of involved in some level or another working with said organisms, whether it's E. coli for a mapping project as an analog form of computation, that's our BioCity map project, or it's mycelium, which is a root base of mushrooms, in this case reishi, that help us make materials that are grown in a lab and turned into something like triply curved surfaces, or even something as prosaic as a chair, to working with butterflies that are on the edge of extinction and designing facade systems to keep them alive, and a whole range of other creatures that we have been working with. And that means that it's not just architects involved. It's we've got entomologists, we've got people who do molecular cell biology. At TerreformOne, we have been engaged in our new overriding predicate, which is design against extinction. So that's our new mission. What was previously a kind of a new order or a series of revelations about organic architecture have now translated, or I should say transitioned, into something that is much more urgent to recognize that the crises we were still in, including this virus, which is this idea of biodiversity and its loss, and our own biology confronting things in nature that are not only killing us off because of our own industries that work on the planet and extract resources, but also exposure to new viruses is another kind of more recent realization. So this idea that we have to design ourselves out of extinction is more prevalent than ever. I think that what we're seeing now is we are facing extinction, and it's due to the fact that that we're one biology. It doesn't matter what your ethnic background is, your income, your religion, what language you speak. We all are being affected by the same virus and can all be affected by the same kind of medical condition that is very real.
Talk to me, Mitch, about this sort of ethical location of this position? Where does this come from in terms of contemporary thinking to talk about all of us as one biology, not only humans, but as all species as one biology? And you have already indicated the idea of staving off extinction as a kind of a goal or direction. So, what is the ethical position that you are taking in focusing on this? It's not an anthropocentrism. Is it a kind of a species being positioned? How do you articulate that?
Well, it's very much in the vein of deep ecology, where you recognize
Yep.
an identification for all living systems, inorganic and organic.
Yep.
So the geological has a kind of an identification. Rocks have a kind of an understanding of a placement in the order of things. The smallest, most minuscule fungi has meaning and identification. All organisms, insects, etc., birds, corals, all of them have a kind of relationship, and it is a relationship without hierarchy. I think that's really important. So RNA-ness.
Why without hierarchy? It seems like the ecologies have all kind of hierarchies.
Yeah, because hierarchy assumes that there's an alpha predator or a kind of a steward, which is often assigned to man as being the leaders or the ones that are responsible for how the web of life is treated. But in reality, if you knock out one major component of this web of life, everything else starts to collapse. And that is the reality. So the idea that there is a pyramidal structure where humans are at the top, or dolphins, depending on your perspective, and everything sort of trickles down is absurd. It is a feedback loop. It's a series of lattices that connect different systems together in a community-based organization. And I think that's new ecology, and that's real ecology. It's either systems thinking or community thinking or both. And it is that, but it's not hierarchical in any sense. We humans are no better than some fungi.
Right. But you sort of privilege what you call pioneering acts of design as a kind of a critical practice over here to combat, as you say, the extinction of all planetary species. So, what do you mean by design from this very specific? What is the act of design in this kind of a integrated, let's say, deep ecological perspective?
Design in our kind of meaning of the term, we like to specify it as something that's known as socio-ecological design. And so we're pioneering design in a new form, one that recognizes that there's a science and an engineering side that produces very specified solutions in very discrete moments in fields that have ways of quantifying and understanding issues. And then there is the social side, which is the capricious public, the leadership class, decisions made from outside the normal realm of science and architecture and urbanism. And that these things need to work in tandem. They both affect one another. And just because science tells us to do it does not mean people go ahead and make those decisions. So we design in that stream. And it's very similar to painting a watercolor in a stream, which is a thing an analogy I often use, which is that you kind of come up with these decisions, but then as you're painting them or putting them down, something else influences them and redistributes the flow. So design needs to be facile. It needs to be constantly reconfigurable. At some moment, it's frozen.
Right.
We get that, but
Right.
in this web of life where we're trying to pioneer or change or innovate, we accept invention as a constant.
And part of this, you also talk about the necessity of being actively, whatever you want to call it, transdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary or undisciplined, if you like.
Yeah.
Are we simply collaborating with ecologists and organicists and nanotechnologists and so on, or is this require a new kind of knowledge engagement across disciplines? What is your sense of that?
Yeah, we think that the kind of the orthodox understanding of architecture and architecture pedagogy, as always, every generation says it's in some kind of crises, and we need to help jumpstart a new system. So we think of it as actually a heterodox. It's a mixture of all disciplines without boundaries or filters, and that it's okay for an architect to change his or her hat and be a car designer, and a car designer to actually think about designing landscapes, and a landscape ecologist designs cars, and that all of these things kind of capture or sort of merge into one another, and you rethink the system in its entirety. So the heterodoxical approach has been something we've adopted, and I think that's just because we really don't want to steal from robotics or borrow from philosophy like we did in the 90s and then stick an architecture label on it. I think we really need a truly remixed primordial soup of different engagements from all professions. Unfortunately, architects are the ones doing most of this work. You'd be hard pressed to find someone in cancer research starting to think about architecture.
But there may be a day when they can do it. There might come a day when they can do it. I mean, in your practice, it seems you are experimentally doing molecular biology or at least some kind of biological work.
Yeah. Early on, we were making a decision. The co-founder, Maria Eilova, and myself, we teamed up with my roommate from school. He was at the Harvard Medical School, and he was doing research on aging and molecular cell biology. And for 7 years, we had been sort of dreaming of a combined studio/laboratory. And the only way to get deep into a kind of a remixed design agenda is to actually have a physical working space that combines both disciplines, if not more. So instead of buying a fancy 3D printer, TerreformOne invested in a fully functional wet cell laboratory with Oliver Medvedik as our molecular cell biologist, who was part of our team for years and still is. He now runs the Kenbar Center for Bioengineering at Cooper Union, but we all together built a lab from scratch. And what would normally cost a few $1 million, we actually put together by using different platforms, Facebook and Craigslist and eBay. We made some of our own equipment. We designed our own. We did a DIY PCR machine. We created our own laminar flow hoods. We got incubators from some folks in North Carolina, where we rented a pickup truck and bought them for next to nothing. Centrifuges, etc. We put together a lab, and then decided on what projects would architects and biologists design side by side. And that became super interesting, because now we were beginning this path of truly thinking about an organic architecture, one that uses living matter directly here at the cellular scale.
It's good to bootstrap this sort of operation, and in India we call it jugaad sort of thinking. But if one is to integrate this into an actual, research and teaching academy, what is your sense of how this would function as a school of, do you want to call it a school of architecture, or do you want to call it a school of what?
Yeah.
And how do you think this kind of a thinking translates into a formalized research and teaching institution?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because this would be a heterodoxic pedagogy, which would upset many of those in administration.
Hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. If they're paying attention, we would do away with the atelier. I mean, we've had this since the Beaux-Arts. We've had the studio model for 2 centuries plus, depending on how you want to count it. And studio is phenomenal, but I think that there's been some very recent movement into this kind of idea of tinkering and DIY and maker spaces. And you'll find a lot of studio desks where they look more like the desk of an inventor or some mad biologist or mad scientist than they do a typical architect with some kind of mechanical drawing system or, a laptop running CAD. So the physical space of the studio itself in a teaching environment needs to change. It's sort of like taking the shop, with the wood shop, which is always separate than the studio itself, and putting a little bit of that on everyone's desk. But it's not just a wood shop.
But can we go more radical than that, and can we imagine a full university which is just nucleated around a series of maker spaces in which there are all kinds of making going on with molecular biologists, nanotechnologists, architects,
Yeah.
and poetry majors working together in a single space at one maker lab and different configurations in others? Is that the kind of university you would imagine?
Yes, and you said it, and I think there's precedent for it. The early models of the Media Lab, the Architecture Machine Group was
Mhm.
just like that under Nicholas Negroponte and eventually Bill Mitchell and others. The Electronic Studio is imagined to be that. That was also William J. Mitchell. And the new lab space that we're in now. So not only can you do this on a pedagogical level as a newfangled university, where all of these things are mixed together, similar to the Media Lab, but that interdisciplinary mindset could exist on a commercial level, which is what we've done at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, producing the new lab. We have 120 different companies that work in waste, food, water, energy, mobility, all different kinds of sectors, and they're on top of one another. And it's this open platform where we share manufacturing spaces and prototyping spaces and build out zones and conference rooms, but that we're learning from one another side by side. And it's very different than a school model. A school model, if you don't succeed, you get a bad grade. In a commercial model, if you don't succeed, you lose everything. All your money's gone and you're out the door. So the stakes are much, much higher, but it's the system that's the same.
Sure.
And the kind of the fertile environment that you create is exciting. It's just electric with energy as people are trying every day, vying for new kinds of concepts and technologies and to learn from one another to pull ahead. And it's super successful. And it's not driven by capitalism. It's driven by curiosity, a much better C word to use. And I think that's
Yeah,
at least that's the type of environment that thrives both in academia and in the kind of commercial world.
And I think that's an important point about access to platforms. And that's exactly what we experience at New Lab, where when you remove the science lab from the science building, and now it just becomes more of a place to experiment, then you get that organic, informal overlaps between people of different backgrounds. And that allows them this sort of collection point of ideas, where then you understand the intelligence of the community. So I think what we're all getting at here is that there seems to be these like trappings of knowledge where things don't spread between fields. And when you start to open up some of these spaces, then you allow those ideas to trickle out and be infused into one another.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's great. So Nick, I mean, let me shift a little bit gears over here and say that so far, and the way you represent yourself, a lot of your work seems to be very well, and I don't mean this glibly at all, but I mean that seriously, as you have described it, very technology driven. It's like developing techniques and ways of working. And yet, I would argue, if one looks at your work, it also has a very distinctive aesthetic, if you like, right? I mean, you have already spoken about the archigram, but there's also sort of the metabolist kind of references. Where do you locate the aesthetics of your work? What is their pedigree?
Well, maybe I can answer this, Nick. I think when it comes to aesthetics, if it isn't directly derived from functionality, which is a huge part of it, and pragmatism, believe it or not, which is a big part of it, it's driven by desire. We actually want to build into the object or the artifact something that just is exciting, that gets people engaged, and that kind of produces a sense of it's fabulous. And I think that's the kind of the cultural side of it. That's though it separates architecture from engineering. At some point, we are just going to do something because aesthetically, it's not pleasing. That's not our goal, but evocative. And I think that is always the kind of base premise when we kind of take on another project.
Describe to me your most evocative, exciting, desirous recent work. Which one really got your blood pumping?
Right. Besides my girlfriend, I guess, which is an ongoing project. I would say, our cricket shelter is a great example. Here we're doing a very
Right.
practical farming system to eat bugs, to replace different types of protein. And I can get more on that later. But at some point, we were dealing with the natural ventilation of the system, and we were hearing the chirping of the crickets come through these wind cowls, these vents. And we thought this was an amazing opportunity, not to just get the ventilation system working, but to accentuate that sound as an instrument and produce what we called cricket horns, so that the sound gets magnified of these crickets chirping, which is actually stratalization. It means that the males are essentially horny because they're past survival, they're well fed, and they're looking to procreate. So we want to celebrate all of our, I guess there would be clients in this case, doing really well in our farm colony, and turn those very subtle sounds into a kind of a cricket opera. So we produce these really extended instruments that move through the wind system and have the cricket chirping magnified. And that's where we go to something that is much that drives into provocation and aesthetics and curiosity, and is not just done to solve a functional condition.
Fantastic. I love the cricket opera concept.
Yeah.
But let's use that as the opportunity to displace the conversation a little bit and say, are you working on a coronavirus shelter? Can we imagine a coronavirus opera? How do you think we should design with life? How does one design with life with respect to the virus, if that's a good term for it?
Right. Yeah, we were just speaking about this earlier today, and yeah, we think that it's a super architectural moment to rethink how we enter and how we inhabit buildings. And the phenomena that goes on in New York City every winter is that all these bars and restaurants build these little vestibules outside so that when they open their entrance doors, they're not directly into the element. So they're into this sort of
Right.
entry space before you get into the main space. And we were just thinking about, well, are there ways to apply this sort of same logic to the virus and sterilization? And you can almost imagine walking through a portal that has UV lights to kill the germs on your body, or there's some type of station inside the bar that then once you pass through, then now you can get food or get a drink. And thinking at the same way that ADA had to deal with the retrofit, right? We had to reimagine stairwells and handrails and access with our existing template and streetscapes. In the same way that with the virus, we can't just reimagine a new city with where we can factor in these social distancing parameters. We have to deal with are often very close encounters.
Right. Let me push a little bit on that. I mean, you're sort of producing like a modification to our urban environment, and I know you all are very interested in its cities and urban transformations as well. Let me fasten in on your use of the word germ and ask, how does the idea of germ, or, if you want, hostile organisms, integrate into an architectural philosophy that is about, as you said, a new kind of an organic architecture? Do we pick and select the organics we work with? Some we work with, some we defend against? Or are we to somehow work with all kinds of organisms?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. In general, we have been working with ideas of modular biodiversity. So we've been creating these mosaic biotope wall systems that are kind of a plug and play facade element that is at a known scale and size, and basically creates a double skin on the outside of your building. And inside it is a terrarium with all different types of flora and fauna that are teeming and engaged and very much alive. And the thought is that it would help some kind of creature that doesn't necessarily have a voice survive and make it off a red list or get out of the endangered species list. and be integrated fully into your building. And this would help incredibly increase biodiversity inside cities, because you'd be able to use.
And that would include germs as well, yes?
It would include a whole host of germs, and many of them, are good for us. Certainly,
Yeah,
exposure
sure.
to them. So when you're talking about something that's dangerous, well, one of the things that a wall system like this does, or other variants, is really look at air quality conditions and airflow conditions. And this becomes a great moderator or filter between us and some kind of outside germ condition, or the interior sort of exhausting into a condition that filters it before it goes to the final layer, the outside air. So it's these kind of buffer zones that use just the right mix of biodiverse elements that sort of moderate the inside and the outside, moving in both directions. And this is nothing new. Anna Dyson did this with Case at Rensselaer, and now she's at Yale. But they were looking at applying plant filters instead of HEPA filters, but live plant species in hospitals as a way of getting rid of germs and potential airborne diseases that exist, that are rampant in hospital environments. Because we're very good at hermetically sealing buildings and then sort of punching a hole in it after we've sealed it completely. So here, these are ways of adding in flow and using the stuff of life, various bits of nature, to kind of clean or cleanse it or have it pass through these filters. That doesn't mean that if we have a particular virus that has a penchant for the kind of plants we're using and it ends up thriving in there and affecting all the humans in a detrimental way, that could possibly happen. But the likelihood of that is I think, less so. It's more likely to be a positive filter for everyone, because we're including thousands of species.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that as we submit to or surrender to or integrate with or work with these sort of broader ecological processes, in which we are not the controlling overlords, then we are definitely likely to be more susceptible to the instabilities and unexpected, negative effects of these systems on us too, right? And we are learning that that's completely true by this pandemic that's around now and probably is going to show up every, I don't know, a minimum 100 years, possibly more. So, and is that acceptable?
Yeah.
Is that acceptable risk?
Well, I think from a philosophical standpoint, man, especially modern man, is suffering from this hubris that thinks that we can control nature and that we are in some kind of level of authority or stewardship or in charge of this system. We are not. We are not at all.
Right.
And this is one of the most humbling moments in modern times, is the COVID-19 virus, where we realize how fragile we are, how easily our system can break down, both biological and economic based, and that this does get us a kind of a sense of togetherness, and realize that nature is still quite the most dominant force here, and that the best hope we have to working and fighting these kinds of things is to spend much more time understanding nature and working with nature, and to defining exactly what we mean by nature. So that in and of itself is an open term. So this is more of the dark ecologist perspective, Tim Morton and others, where this is don't use the term nature. We should use the term ecology, and that at any moment the Earth just needs to shrug and we all disappear. Like we are a momentary blessing on this planet historically.
So talk to me a little bit more about this dark ecologist perspective. Would you identify your work, if dark ecology is about accepting both the positive symbiotic relations, but also simultaneously recognizing that the ecology is also a battlefield with the kind of defenses and that we'll have to put up and fight against certain things. If that is what dark ecology is, do you think your work is participant in that kind of a worldview?
I mean, it is. Our work isn't centered around dark ecology, and others like King's North not just I think they're called the Black Mountaineers or the Black Mountain Group. Like these are individuals that essentially define dark ecology as the science has been out there for some time. The platform about climate change has been out there for some time. Carbon loading in the atmosphere is constantly accelerating. The human race isn't getting it. And no matter what we say or do, from any perspective, humanities or science, we are spiraling into this kind of collision where the environment is going to take us out in one way or the other. So the dark ecologist viewpoint is essentially run and hide, wait for the crises, which is the big premise in dark ecology, which we're in now. COVID-19 is that global.
Here we are. Yeah.
And then after this crisis, we've got one chance to get it right, to create civilization 2.0 that finds a relationship, a symbiotic one with the Earth's metabolism or what have you, but really pays attention to ideas about renewables and how we're poisoning the atmosphere and different types of energy, or we don't get it. And we become susceptible to the next crises, which would wipe us out completely. So this is our big warning. This is the largest possible warning shot across the bow, so to speak, because things like Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, the Valdez spill, the Gulf spill, Fukushima, on and on and on. Apparently they weren't big enough and loud enough. Chernobyl, I guess. Like these were all major crisis-driven events that gave us an understanding of how the environment can be affected and how it ignores geopolitical boundaries and affects all children and all families. So here we are confronting probably the largest one in modern times. And if we don't get it right, shame on us. So this is our kind of clarion call. And a dark ecologist would definitely point to that moment. And so now it's time to rise to the occasion, and it should be easier to explain to the political class and the public at large what kind of problems we're facing when it comes to the environment. And here are some really rational solutions.
But to return to your work, I mean, so what do you think is what would you pick out as some as key trajectories found in your work that you would foreground as we start to think about architecture, rethink architecture in a post-COVID world? What are the things you would highlight from your practice as key DNA to project?
Well, I think our practice had been doing it for the last 14 years. So we were working with live organisms, and now it's becoming almost a must. I think that having the architecture mindset involved in sort of wellness and understanding environment from the perspective of humans, as opposed from the perspective of birds and woods. I think that's another kind of factor that would be a kind of a change for us, because we were always making the argument that it's about the kind of the context, not necessarily us, but the well certification people and others, which we paid attention to. I think now are their sort of voice is going to get a lot louder, because people are going to realize we're fragile, and let's design for an environment that protects us, and in so doing, we are protecting nature around us. So that for our practice, that means absolutely being almost having zero tolerance for the terrible uses of concrete, for steel that's applied in a way that is just superfluous, for materials in general that are high embodied energy and don't really support the Earth's metabolism, and for building topologies that seemingly don't make sense, or are only done because they're driven by economics. Carol Willis's book, Form Follows Finance, will point out to skyscrapers don't make sense financially after 50 something stories. So the idea that we would support, or we would do opposite of supporting, we would criticize, towers that are, have 120 floors because of some kind of ego-driven development, or or a lot of these ones we're seeing in Central Park, these super tall, slender buildings that are just there for the global elite to occupy real estate.
Right.
So I think there's been many who have been sort of making these arguments. We're going to join them, and I think they will be the kind of the dominant point of discussion these days, and not because it's a self-righteous perspective, but because we can't afford to go back to some of the old habits. This should not be driven by clients and their bottom line.
Okay, so
Yeah.
sorry, as we move towards the end over here, a couple of sort of left field kind of questions.
Mm-hmm.
First, well, since you have brought up the question of capitalism driven architectural work, let me first ask quickly. So, how is your practice funded? You are a large group. Yeah, how do you do that?
So we're funded in a number of formats. So one, we have grants that we get from different foundations. Or grants from corporations. So it's either OVARUP, the engineering group, BASF, the R&R Foundation. So these are things that help fund and pay for our staff and employees. So we have a fellowship program that drives that. Then second way we have an income is through commissions in major museums and galleries. So we will get funding to do projects and projects of our own choosing from these kinds of commissions. And then the third way, which is a lot smaller, is from private donations or patrons that work as clients with us, that are enlightened clients that help drive a project or team with us to develop something in tandem.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's I was very excited to see that you had such a strong and vital practice using this model, and with so many people. Generally, more conceptual practices tend to be more smaller. So I think that's a great role model for other practices to think about.
If I can interrupt you, I'll add one last thing. Our secret sauce is Vivian Kwan. She is our executive director, and she has an undergraduate degree from Cornell in architecture, but she has an MBA from the Wharton Business School. And bringing an MBA on the team, talk about heterodox or interdisc practices, it is vital that architects at the highest possible level, if not at all levels, incorporate folks who understand business development, who understand contracts, who understand macroeconomics. Like, these are things that I had 13 years of full-time education in architecture school between the doctorates and 2 master's degrees. I had 1 semester of professional practice. My entire life has been professional practice after I graduated. So we just need more business and understanding business in architecture, period. Bjarke Ingels, his firm, I think something like 25% of the people in his office are MBAs. So there's a big advantage to getting into that language as soon as possible.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to take note.
Yeah. Well, actually right now it's 7:00 in New York City. I don't know if you know about this, but the entire city, every borough, is outside their windows and they're screaming right now. So this has been going on for the last 40 days. So the sound is quite loud where I am in Harlem. I don't know how it is by you, Nick, but it's just, the New York Times did an amazing piece on just how many people are out there screaming. And usually it's celebrating the emergency workers, saying thank you and sending, love beams to these people that are working every day to keep us alive.
Nick and Mitch, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for all your work. And I look forward to another conversation on Architecture Talk.
So thank you for having us. We're really, we're super glad to be here and having this conversation, and honored to be a part of this oeuvre of other amazing speakers and thinkers that we can see with this podcast. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, Please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thank you again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.